Japanamerica is a personal story. It's not, saying Japanese culture is perfect or Japanese culture is your fantasy. It's saying these are the individuals who made this story happen. Hayao Miyazaki said to me at one point, the problem with young anime artists today is the only thing they study is anime. And one of the key findings I had was that Japan didn't promote itself well at all. They really did not care. Somebody wanted it outside of Japan. So they made no effort.
Thanks for joining us on Unpacking Japan, proudly produced by our team at Zen Studio with the long-standing support of Zen Group. To keep these weekly stories coming, please consider subscribing. It's the best way to support the show and really makes a difference. And now, let's get into it. Welcome to Unpacking Japan. I'm Toby, and today we have the pleasure to welcome Roland Kelts. Thank you so much for coming.
Hi, Tobias.
You're an author, you're also a journalist, an editor, and a scholar. You've worked at and taught at many universities across, Japan and the US mostly. You've got a huge body of work, some of which is here on the table. We've got your book, Japanamerica, which is celebrating its 20th year this year. You are also an editor on the magazine Monkey, which releases this English edition once a year. Super interesting. And we'll talk about that later. And we also have your beautiful book here, The Art of Blade Runner Black Lotus, which is a beautiful hardcover. A lot of interesting works. And before we talk about all of your work and what you're doing nowadays, because you have this very interesting documentary coming up about Tezuka-san, for people who are familiar with Astro Boy. I want to understand your journey a little bit, because I mentioned your full name, that includes Nozomu, and you were just telling me as we were starting the recording that it's a name that was given to you by your grandfather.
That's right, yeah.
So I imagine that you had a strong connection to Japan then from a very young age.
Yeah, I lived with my grandparents when I was 5.5 years old in Morioka, Japan, in their home, and I went to kindergarten in the local school. All of my memories of that are rose-colored, pink-colored, lovely. But my mother reminded me somewhat recently that I was actually absolutely miserable at school, because I was a half-breed kid, a mutt, in a Japanese kindergarten in Morioka, which was hardly the most international city at that time, especially. And so they had to pick me up at school and bring me home because I would be weeping, crying. It sounds pretty awful, actually, what she described, but I forgot it. I completely forgot it. All I remember is my grandfather watching Ultraman with me and tatami mat floors and sumo wrestling and Doraemon, which I fell in love with as a child. And my grandmother making me these incredible breakfasts with the thick toast, which I wasn't used to in the States.
The kisaten toast.
Correct. And heaps of jam she would get, and the little sausages. I loved my grandmother's breakfasts. And I loved them both, actually. They used to come visit us in the States when I was growing up. So I had a very strong connection through my grandparents. My grandfather was a scholar and a poet, so he had lived in China, traveled very widely, wrote 7 books, including 3 books of essays. And my grandparents were really gutsy travelers for their generation. So I saw them a lot in the States. They used to come and watch me play soccer and ice hockey. And my uncle, my mother's brother, and cousins would come visit, and I would go see them in the summers. So I always had this kind of a double life. I was growing up mostly in the States, but then there was this other world, isekai, So I really get that anime manga meme. But this other magical, it felt quite magical, this world in Japan that I actually lived in.
So I imagine the school year in the US and then the summers maybe or during vacations spent here in Japan. When you're a child, you just described your memories were still very rosy. It's all this time spent with your grandparents. At what point do you kind of become very conscious of this isekai, of this second world, and to the point that you may realize, there'll be a point in time where maybe I have to decide whether I want to live here or there, or maybe in both, and be more not just so to say your parents making the decisions for you, but you deciding on where you want to go and what you want to do?
That's a great question. It actually went through phases with me. I think as a young child, as I said, my memory is I loved it, although my mother reminded me that at school I didn't like at all. But then I didn't like school in the US either. So I went through phases, I think, I was 5.5 years old, so it's very, hazy. But as an early teen, I liked it a lot. I hated school in America. I didn't like America very much. So I loved to get on a plane with my mom, fly to, you had to stop then on the way to Japan from the East Coast. So you'd have to go to Boston to San Francisco or Vancouver, refuel. And so often we would spend one night in a hotel in Canada or the West Coast. And then when we got to Tokyo, we would spend some nights in a hotel.
Before going to Morioka.
Before going to Morioka. So she would see some of her old classmates and friends in Tokyo. And I loved that. And to this day, I love staying in hotels. In fact, I often prefer hotels to homes or apartments. I love the freedom, the sense of clean spaces. And as a kid, I thought it was so romantic. I mean, looking out the window of a hotel at, San Francisco skyscrapers or Vancouver or whatever, it was just magical. So I loved those trips. And then I think when I got into my teens, I began to wonder what it meant. In other words, there was the typical adolescent identity crisis was exacerbated by being between worlds. And I should add that my parents moved me within the United States 9 times before I graduated high school.
Okay. Well,
and often in the middle of the school year. So one of my most vivid memories is entering a classroom with some teacher's hand on my shoulder. And usually they're mispronouncing my name, like, this is Roland Kelts, something like that. Ronald Sleck or something. And, all these kids in the room looking up at me. And at that time, in most of the Northeast, they were all white. And I had this black hair, jet black hair at the time, kind of bowl cut. And I think looking at photos, most of my friends say that I looked more Japanese when I was a kid. My face, the way it was formed. And so it was always entering this classroom as this half Asian kid in the middle of the school year. And I don't think I'll ever forgive my parents for that, because it was very disorienting. And on top of that, having this Japanese identity complicated it. On the one hand, it seemed romantic. On the other hand, as I got older as a teenager, I didn't know what to do with it. It wasn't really cool. Most of the kids didn't know what Japan was. If they did know, that somebody might say, "Oh, do you eat raw fish? Ew." And that was about it. So I have very mixed feelings about having that, at the time, liminal identity. I think, not to psychoanalyze myself, but I think it taught me as an adult to be able to speak to different audiences. To look into an audience's eyes and get the context and figure out what they wanted from me. Because I had to, how hypersensitive you are as a kid, especially at early adolescence. I had to find a way into that crowd.
So with these school years being so disorienting in the United States, was Japan sort of like beacon of stability in a way, at least in your mind, that you thought, oh, maybe if I go to Japan, it'll be more stable. I'll just be seen for who I am. I might fit in more, and something you sought after?
It was definitely much safer, partly because it was more alien, and partly because I knew, in America, I thought I'm supposed to fit in. In Japan, I knew I wouldn't fit in. One of the great things about Japan, or I suppose a pro and a con, is that, there's such an insider-outsider line. Uchi and Soto are so distinct, whether it's taking your shoes off when you enter a house, the difference between the inside and the outside. Very, very demarcated. And so I knew when I came to Japan, I was the family member from America. And if I went to a ramen stand in the middle of the city street, they used to have a lot more yatai back then, and
before the laws changed.
Yeah. And if I ordered ramen from this yatai, all these salarymen would look down at me and smile and poke each other and ask me simple questions in Japanese, and then try to say hello. And so it was kind of easier because I was always an outsider. And then, but in the States, I thought, I'm supposed to fit in with these people.
So when did you make that decision to move yourself to Japan, so to say?
Oh, that was 1998. And that was a commission. That was a job.
Okay.
Francis and Sofia Coppola, the director, and his daughter, they were starting at the time a magazine called Zoetrope. It's still going. Zoetrope is the name of his original studio. And Zoetrope magazine was this magazine where they wanted to publish literary fiction and try to use it as a springboard for screenplays.
Okay.
Francis was basically very, very, I can call him Francis. He was very frustrated, probably still is, with the state of screenplay writing in America. And he used to say to me, all these kids are coming out of film school and they learn a kind of paint by numbers screenplay. So they're all competent, but none of them are inventive.
They just follow like a typical pattern, but they don't kind of find a way to break the rules within the...
Yeah, it's funny. It's similar to what Hayao Miyazaki said to me at one point. Some years ago, I've interviewed him a few times, and he said to me, the problem with young anime artists today, anime directors, is the only thing they study is anime. He said, when we were young, we studied French literature, we studied Impressionism, we read Dostoevsky, we swallowed everything, and then we went and created original anime. But he said, if you grow up and all you watch is anime, you're just regurgitating spinning wheels. And that was somewhat similar to what Francis was saying way back in the 90s, which he was telling me, all these screenplays. So he wanted to turn short stories into movies. And they commissioned me to do a cover story, a short story, fiction, set in Japan, because they knew I was half Japanese. And when I got that assignment, I thought, this is fantastic. They're going to pay me for rough drafts. They're going to pay me a fee for the treatment, the film treatment. Who wouldn't want it? This is fantastic, especially if you're a fiction writer.
Yeah.
And then I thought to myself, I don't know squat about Japan. I knew about Japan through my mom. I knew about it on an intimate family level. But as a fiction writer, what happens at a city bar, what happens at the corner, kisa, what's going on? What are these places? So I told my mother, I said, I gotta go to Japan for a year and write this treatment. And she basically said, well, you can't just barge in on your my brother or your grandparent. You can't just put up with them for a year. You're an adult. So I did something called the JET program.
Okay.
A lot of people don't realize I was a JET.
So the assignment was not like a full-time thing. It was, here's a budget, please work on this, provide all of this, but then for the rest, you have to figure it out by yourself in a way. Yeah,
there was the money was more than enough. But the question of just, I was living in New York City for years, and the question of just packing things up and going to Japan for a year wasn't so easy. And I guess it was one of my mother's friends who said to her, oh, tell him to do the JET program because, the government sets you up. They take care of you. They give you, and I had already taught, at NYU in the States and a couple of private schools. So I had teaching experience. So it was kind of a no-brainer. Just apply for this, get the gig, go to Japan. You get paid, but you're also getting paid to write. And I double-checked with a lot of JET people, do you have to work around the clock? And they all said, no. You go in for a couple classes, you go home, you can travel, you have this quite a bit of flexibility.
Where did you end up with the JET program?
Right here, Osaka.
Wow, that's quite rare to be in the big cities. Most of the time, people end up in quite rural areas of Japan. But
yeah, I think I got lucky. I was right up the street, actually, living near Umeda.
Okay.
Higashi Honjo Higashi.
Yeah.
Sanchome.
Well, I used to live there.
Did you?
Yeah.
Same neighborhood?
Yeah. I
Oh my
moved
God.
away from there like 2 years ago.
Right by the Yodogawa.
Yeah.
We would have been neighbors.
Probably. You might have been working at the school that was in front of my apartment. Who knows?
I loved it. I absolutely loved it.
Small world.
Yeah.
So how was it for you after so many years of back and forth spending the summers with your grandparents in Morioka to suddenly be here on a JET program, to work full-time, but also to have that assignment and to maybe discover a side of Japan that you hadn't really experienced up until that point?
The very first month we were here, I mean, I was with the whole group, was August. It was just dreadful. And the guy who's you sort of exchange apartment, you get the next guy's apartment, or the guy vacates his apartment and you take it. He left it just rubbish. It was a wreck. I had to clean this thing, and it was so hot, just unbelievably hot. And I had a list of family, relatives and friends in the area, and I called exactly one. I really thought I made a mistake. I just thought, what am I doing? In New York, I have publishers, I have editors, I have friends on every corner in Chelsea. What am I doing here? Mm-hmm. And it seemed very, very alienating. And it's kind of pathetic, I realize now, because I didn't have my mom. So I was suddenly in Japan, but no sort of purpose. And I finally called one of the friends of my mother's, and she lived in Kobe. And she invited me out to a kind of fireworks, it was kind of Obon related thing by the coast in Kobe. And we had yakitori on the beach and chuhai and stuff like that. And I think we stayed on the beach that night. Like we all slept there.
Oh.
We had sleeping bags. I don't know if we had sleeping, maybe just blankets or towels. Anyway, I was young. And so I woke up on this beach in Kobe with, my friend. His name was Atsuko. I don't know what she's doing now, but she was sweet, very sweet, nice group of young people. And we really had a lot of fun. And that was the first night I thought, oh, maybe this could be kind of cool, because there was something magical waking up on a beach in Kobe and then taking the train back to my apartment.
I can imagine. That's a quite unique experience. Nowadays, probably some guard will come chasing you up from the beach at nighttime after the sun sets.
Or there'd be tourists inundating your bonfire.
So that kind of changed your perspectives a little bit, and you had that year to work on the story.
I don't want to say it all happened in one night, but there was a night when I remember very, very distinctly coming back to my apartment on the train in Osaka and thinking, this could be all right. I can make this work. And that really, then I started diving into the city of Osaka and hanging out, because, as a fiction writer, you have to get some material.
Mm-hmm.
You
people, see places.
Yeah, overhear conversations. I've ended up making friend after friend, and people who would tell me about, the great Yakuza enclaves in Hyogo, and I would go visit them. And so I started really digging in. And it turned out to be an extraordinary year. Just great. That's the year I met Haruki Murakami.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just a side story, how did you end up meeting him? Because you mentioned now Francis and Sofia Coppola. You mentioned Hayao Miyazaki and now Haruki Murakami.
That was a really weird story. It's a totally true story. There was an English language magazine here at the time called Kansai Time Out. Mm-hmm. And the guy who was editing it, really cool guy, he used to have these tachigui things. You'd go drink with the other editors and just chat. So I had been. They got wind of me being from New York, and they knew I'd published. So they asked me to contribute. So I'd written 2 or 3 articles about the region, and we were drinking, and they somehow, one of them knew I had reviewed Wind Up Bird Chronicle for the Philadelphia Inquirer, and so. After a couple of drinks, they started saying, hey, do you think you could interview Haruki Murakami? And I said, I have no idea. And I didn't really know he had a reputation as a kind of recluse at the time. So they said, the bet was like, we'll buy you dinner or something pathetic. But they said, we'll get you dinner if you can get an interview with Haruki Murakami for this dinky little regional magazine. So I put together a manila envelope with some of my short stories, published short stories. I had a cover letter. My name is Roland Kelts. I'm half Japanese, blah, blah, blah. I reviewed Wind Up Bird Chronicle. I sent the review. It's just on a whim. I sent it up to his office in Tokyo. And it was like 2 weeks later, I came home from one of the schools where I was teaching, and there was a big fax. Everybody had these fax machines then, right? And it had a map. I knew I got lucky when I saw the map. I thought, whoa. And it was from Office Murakami. They call it Office Murakami. And I pulled up the fax, and sure enough, it was his assistant saying, Mr. Murakami has agreed to meet with you if you can come up to Tokyo to the office next month. Here are 3 dates that would be open for him. So I was pretty excited. I should have been more excited. I didn't quite realize the magnitude of being coming out of nowhere and getting a yes.
And years later, I see you recently had this article on the Japan Times talking with him about jazz. So that was the first time, but now it's kind of a regular occurrence.
Well, I would say a regular occurrence, but I've interviewed him many, many times, and we've had dinner together, and we've gotten to know each other over the years. And he's a very sweet man. But that was the first time. It was 1999, so it's 27 years ago.
And that year, you also had this project that you needed to finish, right, for Francis Coppola. What story came out of that assignment? It's
the title. I titled it "Hereupon My Heroine." Hereupon My Heroine, and Hereupon was actually named after the statue, the kind of grotesque, graphic statue by Takashi Murakami, who was not nearly as famous back then. And neither was Haruki. Actually, Haruki was known, but not like globally today, famous. And I had gone to some exhibit, again, with a friend who invited me, and he was, check out this guy who does this stuff with pop culture. He blows it up. He exaggerates it. He makes commentary, social commentary. So I went to this exhibition. It was Takashi Murakami. And I saw this Hereupon statue, and it kind of blew me away. The huge breasts and the milk, swirling milk, rope of milk.
For people who haven't seen it, they can Google it.
You can Google it now. It's all over the place. But at that time, it seemed, striking and new. And, I think we were still using dial-up or ISDN back then. So you couldn't just look these things up. And so, and I really got down into the etymology of Hereupon. You may know it was also a street name for the kinds of uppers that Japanese construction workers took after the war to keep going.
I did not know.
Yeah, it was called Hereupon. It was a street name. So the Hereupon name for this kind of high that you get in the post-war rebirth of Japan seemed to me a great metaphor, and then combined with this erotic imagery. And I made the story, I thought, quite sexy, a couple of sex scenes in it. And I sold it to them. They were thrilled. They were really, really happy. And it was great as a fiction writer, which is how I started writing short stories, to have this story featured as a cover story in Coppola's literary magazine. And, like anything, when you start producing work, you get more work. So it was to have a year in Japan where I met Murakami, I met Miyazaki. I actually did meet Takashi Murakami, although it was very brief. He was at the show. And then made all these friends, and then ended up writing this short story that got published. Then I wrote, obviously, an interview with Murakami that got published. And suddenly, it really happened very, very quickly. I don't think it was even a full year. It might have been 11 months.
So you at the time are still on the JET program.
Yes.
And I imagine very quickly your mind starts shifting to, well, maybe I can stay here longer. I can do something else and not go and teach at the schools, but focus more on the writing side of things.
Yeah, except I've always, and to this day, I get back to New York several times, many times a year. And I was aware enough, looking around at, especially at the other JET people and other English teachers, of the kind of, what I call velvet coffin, that kind of life can be. at the time, there were Canadians and Australians who were here who could, because of the currency rate, they could teach English and make enough money in their local currency. In other words, the yen, when they sent it back in their local currency, they could buy property. So there were Canadians and Australians who would stay here for 3, 4, 5 years. And
that is certainly not possible today.
You go bankrupt very quickly.
So some people,
but that was true,
get very comfortable, or got very comfortable at least in those positions. But for you, that was like not so appealing.
No, and there was enough internet access at that time that every night, this is really going to date me, but there was something called telehodai offered by NTT at the time, and what it was a discount. So between, I think it was 11 p.m. and 4 a.m., you could use the internet on the telephone line. So it was dial-up or ISDN telephone for like 3 yen a minute or something. It was much cheaper. It was 10 yen every other time of the day. Yeah, telehodai. So at 11 p.m., everybody would send their emails and go online, which of course would slow everything down. But what you could do is you could write the emails offline, right?
And then just send.
And then at 11, just automatic, and just the whoosh, that audio they used to accompany the emails going out. And so I would come home, wherever I was out having dinner or whatever, I'd come home, write several emails to editors, fellow writers, friends in New York, and line them up, ready to go, like little soldiers, ready to parachute. And then I'd go run my bath, and at 11 o'clock, hit send when the discount rate hit, and they would just all start rolling out. And by the time my bath was ready, usually they were all sent. But the reason I mention that is because I was very, very conscious of keeping a connection to New York. And as I said, to this day, I'm keenly proactive about that. I don't come here and lose touch with New York or LA or friends around the world, because I do think it's one of the dangers of especially expats living in Japan. You can become stuck here. And it's not Japan's fault. It could happen anywhere. But Japan does remain somewhat insular and isolated. And it's such a codified society that I was aware very, very quickly, and I actually may have gotten advice from other people as well, not to isolate yourself from the rest of the world.
Stay in motion and connected to people all around.
Yeah, and of course I knew, practically speaking, I was never going to be a Japanese writer. It was too late. I didn't grow up in Japan enough. I wasn't going to be writing fiction in Japanese. My audience was not going to be Japanese, except for those Japanese who read English and the works that I write that get translated. But beyond that, my readers are English language readers. So for me to just focus on Japan would be incredibly naive. So I kept that going throughout the year, phone calls to the States, to a couple people in London I stayed in touch with. And as that first year wound down, JET offers you, I think it's up to 5 years now. At the time, I think it was 3. And everyone I was with was like, of course, I'm going to renew. And I think I was the only one who said, no, I'm not doing it. And, I had really good friends on the program too. And they're like, you sure? It's a piece of cake, just renew and do one more year at least. And the teachers, the schools,
the kids.
But I just thought, no, you can't. If I do that, I'm going to get stuck in this cycle. And I could see, I'm sure you've seen this type of gaijin at the bars whining about Japan, one too many beers, complaining, the schools, the people, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And I just thought, I can't become one of those people. And so I went running back to New York. And I'm glad I did that, because I spent the next almost a year in New York, touching base, reconnecting, the editors, and so on. And of course, unsurprisingly, most of them wanted stories about Japan.
And one of the stories that came from all of that research and that motion a couple of years later was this book.
That's right.
Japanamerica. Now, nearly 20 years this year that it's been published. Yeah. It's a book where you basically look at how Japanese pop culture found its place in the United States and influenced American culture after that. So far, you mentioned that as a child, you have these memories of watching Ultraman with your grandfather. You fell in love with Doraemon, and you wrote that first screenplay for the magazine, also about hero porn, which is kind of touches upon pop culture. Murakami is now, both of them are now very popular here and worldwide. Where did this interest come from to the point that you decided to dedicate an entire book to the study of Japanese pop culture?
Well, actually, the publisher commissioned the book from me. So I can't take credit for any initiative.
So when that commission came, though, did you feel like it was a topic that you were already familiar with enough to get to work on that? Or did you feel that you had the commission, you started digging, and you realized how deep that actually went?
Actually, initially, without even digging, I said no. For two reasons. I didn't really appreciate how big the boom was becoming. Mm-hmm. So, I had been living in Japan. This is 2005. 2005, I think they commissioned it. I'd been living in Japan. I moved back after being in New York for roughly a year. So I moved back in 2000 and really dug in and decided I'm going to stay in Japan a while because I'm getting commissioned to do stories here. I'm meeting more and more people. And so by 2005, I actually ended up in New York. I was house sitting at this beautiful apartment with my then girlfriend. We were house sitting on the Upper West Side. It was one of these, gorgeous pre-war apartments, just beautiful. And it was incredible to have this. And that's when they contacted me, Macmillan. And they said, we'd like to talk to you about a book project. So I went out with these editors, we had lunch, and they pitched this idea. Didn't have a title then, but this concept, pop culture in the United States. And I said, no, guys, I'm not. I knew enough then to know that there were real otaku types. There were mostly white male Americans with robot collections and, very childish guys, but passionate. And I just thought, I'm not one of those guys. And in fact, I found them a bit offensive because I knew Japan as the child of a Japanese mother and as the grandchild and as the nephew. And I knew that what these American otaku in particular were practicing was a kind of Orientalism. Mm-hmm. They were exoticizing, they're treating Japan like Japan was their fantasy, where Japan was sort of delivering their joys and their fantasies. And it was offensive to me, irritating. So I initially was turned off. I said, no, I'm not going to do this. I'm not I'm not that type.
What changed your mind?
Two things. One, I should say three things. One was I started talking to some college student. I was at NYU. I was, are you guys into this stuff or is this really popular? And starting to hear from younger Americans that I love it. And they weren't all otaku types. And then the second thing that changed my mind was I was home with my father, who was American. And he's a very American guy. I mean, my mother and father are not just from two cultures. They were really different kinds of people. And we were sitting at home at Thanksgiving, and the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade was on. And Pikachu was in it.
Okay.
It was Bullwinkle and Spider-Man and Casper the Ghost or whatever. And then Pikachu. And my father said to me, what is that thing? Because he recognized all the other cartoon characters. Mm-hmm. And I said, oh, you know what that is? And he's like, no. I said, it's from Pokemon. It's a Japanese animation card game, video game. Oh, wow, that's really wild. And I realized when he said that at the time, I think maybe Hello Kitty was also there, but they were the only balloons of characters that were not American. And I thought, that's pretty extreme that the only, I mean, they could be French or British or something, but the only characters represented in the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade, which is such an American holiday. No one else celebrates Thanksgiving, right?
Oh, the Canadians.
Yes, I'm sorry, the Canadians. Sorry about that, Canada. But otherwise, nobody else celebrates it. And the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade is kind of the apogee in terms of festival, Matsuri, right? It's an American Matsuri. And then here are these characters, and particularly Pikachu, this yellow thing, that are from Japan. You know, what's going on? So that kind of tweaked me. And when I went back to New York and we had another lunch, Toby Wall, who ended up being my primary editor on the book, was listening to me tell this story. And he turned to me and he said, "Write the book for your dad." And then that changed my mind. Because I thought, okay, if I'm writing, I wanted him to know. And if I'm writing for an American guy who doesn't know anything about this, and I can write and tell the story, because I wasn't so much drawn to, you know, a fact machine book, another fact book about pop culture. But the idea of telling a story to my father, this is what happened in Japan after World War II. This guy, Osamu Tezuka, watched Disney's Bambi 81 times and was so heavily influenced. However, he took off in a different direction. He didn't replicate Disney at all. And this other form of expression emerged in this country that happens to be the country of your wife's heritage. Then it kind of gripped me. And I think the other thing that I realized at that point was I could make it personal. You know,
you just mentioned Osamu Tezuka, also the topic of a documentary that is in the works.
Yeah.
Was he kind of then the starting point for the narrative, the story, and everything that unfolded?
Very much so. When I got back to Tokyo, when I started the book, I was in New York. So I was like sending emails out to contacts here. Who can I talk to? This, that, the other thing. But yeah, it was pretty sloppy researching at first. I literally ordered a bunch of DVDs, like the major titles, you know, Akira, Evangelion, just sort of got this stack. And I thought, you know, I'm going to sit in this living room, this big screen TV, and watch these things. You know, it was winter in New York, so it was cold. And I just sat with a notebook and took notes. And it sounds kind of depressing, but it was actually really enlightening, because what I realized, and my first passion has always been literature. It's what I taught, it's what I studied. I went to Oberlin College and Columbia University, and the focus was always literature and literary writing. And what I realized watching these films was they were very, very sophisticated. Not all of them, but most of them. And, you know, I had some people advising me on what to watch. And I thought, wow, this is like serious stuff. This isn't all Pokemon. And not to say Pokemon isn't brilliant in its own way. But I was watching, you know, stuff like Jinro and Akira and Evangelion and Ghost in the Shell. And I was thinking, wow, this is pretty, you know, it's philosophical. It's literary in some cases. Certainly Grave of the Fireflies, Takahata Isao. Obviously Miyazaki's work up to that point. So that also galvanized me. You know, I thought, this is, I got to write this. This is good stuff. And there wasn't that much out there. There were giants whose shoulders I stood on, and they were the people I interviewed, including Professor Susan Napier, who's a dear friend of mine now, Frederick L. Schott, who's also a dear friend of mine. Their books and their writings were crucial to me. And Susan, her background is also in literature. She started, and she's still a Japanese literary scholar, and she got turned on to anime when she saw Akira in London, way back when it came out. So there was this convergence. I realized that, this doesn't have to be like some complete departure from what I love. And this idea of this Japan-American, you know, cycle and relationship is embodied in my family. So that really tickled me. And then I think I also thought on something I alluded to earlier, which is that I felt a bit resentful that these otaku, Western otaku, treated Japan like their possession and like their little pet. And it was condescending. It still is sometimes. You go to an anime convention, the way sometimes American fans or Western fans talk about Japan, it's very condescending. It's like it's a childish culture and they have fun with it. They can giggle and goof around because it's silly. And that really irritates the hell out of me because it's not. It's a very serious culture in a lot of ways. And if you live here, as you know, far from the case that everyone loves anime or manga.
So there's this group of people that have this strong interest in Japan, otakus, and they have their perception about Japan. You start researching for your book, seeing how everything is maybe interconnected and what happens behind it. And also at the same time, I think Japan was pushing for this Cool Japan campaign in a way, kind of also advertising these aspects of Japan specifically to these foreign audiences to make Japan cool. So when you write and work your way through this book, what is kind of the one of the key findings you had or realizations from doing that research and putting it together?
Well, actually, one of the key findings I had was that Japan didn't promote itself well at all. I was astonished case after case after case to find out that the success of these anime and manga titles and even cosplay and all of that stuff came mostly from demand, not the supply side. At that time, Japanese companies did very little advertising. The streaming thing had yet to take off. YouTube was there, and anime was very popular on YouTube, but it hadn't exploded yet. I did predict this in the book. I predicted that this was going to explode, that the DVD thing was dead and it was going to be online only. And that I knew from insiders at the time, insiders in America, that what they wanted to do was get as close to simultaneous as possible. In other words, completely bridge the Japan gap so that what Japanese fans see, American fans and European fans see at the same time.
Because I remember when I was growing up and manga were coming out translated in French and such, it would be months after the originals were released. If Japan didn't promote itself that well, and the situation now is maybe different from at the time, but at the time already there were groups of fans from these animes and such. How did these animes kind of cross the Pacific in a way and found that much popularity overseas without any actual promotions by the creators? What resonated so much?
Well, you have to read the book. No. Yeah, it is true. Some of that is in the book, but they were pioneers. I mean, one of the things that drew me to the research more and more was actually meeting real people and realizing that this guy, Fred Ladd did this and Patton did that, and these guys in the States and in Europe who were kind of pioneers of promoting this stuff. There's great stories I heard in the States of people getting together. An anime convention was everybody gets together in a motel, cheap motel one weekend. They put in the video cassettes and one person in the room, maybe a Japanese person, maybe somebody who studied Japanese, one person shouts the translations as the videotape, usually squiggly, bad quality, is playing. But the passion is so intense. And I knew something about that because I was a music fan as a kid. I still am, getting bootlegs and stuff like that. The degrees to which people would go to get a bootleg record by their favorite band or favorite jazz musician, and the degrees to which they would go, even if the sound quality was awful, just to hear, Miles live in Sweden, that recording, because he played an incredible solo, or Coltrane did this. So I knew something about that, and I heard these stories, and it drew me to these people. But it was very heavily demand-driven. I should make some exceptions. There were some pioneering people, Ogino-san, whom I've written about, who was working at Tuttle, the publishers in Japan, and she just somebody called her. I think it was Kodansha, and said, or Shueisha, maybe it was, we need some help. We have all these faxes from Spain. And that was ended up being the first legitimate foreign publication of Dragon Ball, the manga, in 1992. And it's because Ogino-san could read English. They called her and they said, we got this faxes. They've been coming for months from this woman named Monty Samon in Spain. And she seems to want something. So could you read them and call her? And so Ogino-san went over to Shueisha and read these things and was like, oh, she just wants to publish Dragon Ball. And, nobody could read the faxes and nobody cared. She told me that. The manga industry sold enough manga here at home. The anime industry had enough market share in Japan. They really did not care if somebody wanted it outside of Japan. So they made no effort. So it was really fan driven. And then a few pioneers along the way who started companies. Central Park Media in New York was one of the big ones. John O'Donnell. Tokyo Pop, in the manga sphere. So I wrote about all that, and I was surprised, really surprised at how little Japan did. Again, with very few exceptions. I have to say the Pokemon people, they knew they had a hit. They signed a terrible contract, and that's in the book too. They hemorrhaged money the first 4 to 6 years of Pokemon because they signed all the subsidiary rights to this guy in New York. They didn't read the contract. They had, 40-page, maybe it was 80-page contract came in from New York, and they thought, oh, we're going to get, $10 million in the bank overnight. And they signed it. Well, they didn't read all the clauses that said you're signing away subsidiary rights. So for several years, the man and the company that made almost the lion's share of money off all the Pokemon offshoots, including the first Pokemon movie, was a guy named Alfred Kahn. Alfred Kahn and his company was called 4Kids in New York City.
Okay.
And now at his former university in Long Island, there's an Alfred Kahn Arts Center.
Yes, and he probably really enjoyed receiving that contract signed after he sent it over.
I'm sure he was thrilled. And, it took them, they had the people behind Pokemon, the companies behind it, had to work with Nintendo USA's legal team. And of course, they're all American lawyers to claw back the rights to the original creators.
That must have been
years.
quite a battle, quite a legal battle.
So it should have been an object lesson for Japanese companies. And to some extent it was, which is if you're going to do business outside of Japan, you have to hire somebody who can read the contract. If it's in English, you probably have to hire an American lawyer. You can't have a Japanese lawyer do this. And you're going to have to negotiate. You can't just be congenial and can't be coerced into this. Consensus won't work here. You're going to have to say no if they're taking away subsidiary rights.
You wrote this book 20 years ago after you've seen Pikachu and Hello Kitty on the Macy's Day Parade so that your dad could understand it a little bit more. A lot of things have happened in 20 years, and pop culture, especially Japanese pop culture, has boomed overseas. Manga and anime, which used to be maybe niche things, are now mainstream. What makes this book so relevant still today in its 20-year edition?
Yeah, I have to admit, I'm surprised because I didn't expect to be getting royalty checks this long after it was published. And, I was in Seoul a couple of weeks ago at a film festival, judging a film festival. And in my hotel, 2 young women came up with copies and asked to get it signed. And I wasn't there for Japanamerica. I was there to, judge Korean films. So it surprises me a bit, but people have come up to me and said, on the one hand, it's personal. Like most books about Japanese pop culture are sort of academic or they're fact machines. They're just, running through fact, A lot of English language books about Japan, the writer seems to be out to prove that he or she knows more about Japan than anybody else, which is incredibly boring and off-putting to me.
They want to place themselves as the expert.
Exactly. And so Japanamerica is a personal story. It's the story of artists, individuals. It's not, saying Japanese culture is perfect or Japanese culture is your fantasy or Japanese culture is that. It's saying these are the individuals who made this story happen. Mm-hmm. And so I think that part of it feels timeless. And in fact, just, I think all the people I profiled are still working. So they're committed, they're professionals. And at the same time, I think I will take credit for anticipating some of the technological shifts that I saw coming in 2006, 2007, that have really flourished since then. And I think the analysis of the business of anime still holds today, which is that sadly, most people in the industry get paid very poorly, sometimes below living wages. They still live with their parents. That was true then. Sadly, the talent for hand-drawn animation was dying out. It's pretty much gone now. You can't find young people who know how to draft. It's very rare in anime. I think that the business side, the fact that it was poorly run on the Japanese side, that there were these production committees that were inefficient, that hemorrhaged talent, that's all still the case, for better or worse. And I have to give credit here that one of my colleagues, I was editing a magazine called Japan Inc. at the time in Tokyo, and one of my colleagues there, a journalist named Leo Lewis, who's British, terrific journalist and writer, he really helped me out on the business section of the book. It would have taken me much more time. He's a Financial Times editor, writer now. He was with the Times of London. And he just had these contacts at places like Nomura Securities. There were no white papers on the anime industry at that time. Now there's an annual report. At that time, there was nothing. So in order for me to delve into some numbers on the business, not just say, oh, it's a crappy business, but to actually see what's going on here, Leo was instrumental. I actually asked the publisher to put his name on the cover, but they refused.
So thank you, Leo, for the business.
Thank you, Leo. Yes, Leo, I owe him.
For you as an author, putting out this book, what has changed? You explained earlier that when you are a creative or you do any kind of work, putting out work leads to more work usually and more opportunities. Yeah. For this book, you've had to get in touch with multiple people in the industry and beyond. But once it's out there and many people read it, what has changed for you as an author?
So much. That's a huge question because, and I really didn't expect that. I thought the book would come out, make a minor splash with a subculture community, a tribe. I would go to some anime conventions, and then it would be out of print. That was it. It really was transformative, and I was saying this, even though like I had friends, older writer friends at the time. I went to Columbia University in the writing program there. And so I have quite a few friends who've published sometimes several books in some cases. And I remember one of my friends, Martha McPhee, who's a terrific novelist, John McPhee's daughter. And she said to me one night at a bar, she said, one thing you should know about publishing a book, any book, is you think it will change your life. And it probably won't. So, you'll wake up the next morning, you have a copy of your new book and it's on the bookshelves and you do some readings and some people get it signed. But your life fundamentally does not change. You're probably not going to have $1 million in the bank and you're not going to buy a new house, etc.
Unless it's one of those few books like Game of Thrones that suddenly take the world by storm.
It's not always the case, but Martha's a literary novelist. And so I always took that to heart. Like, do the work, commit yourself, but love the work. Don't focus on the end product. But actually with Japanamerica, it did change my life because I thought I was doing this research on anime and manga and pop culture, this phenomenon, write these sort of essays about it, put it together in this book, and then move on. And what happened was the book became such a critical source, not just for fans and parents of kids into anime and manga, but also professors. It ended up being a really great, especially for undergraduates. It's not graduate level. It's not an academic book. But undergraduates who are into Japan or Asia want to know about these phenomena. The book is a pretty breezy read. It's pretty easy to follow. I deliberately didn't put too much information in to bore the heck out of a 25-year-old, a 22-year-old. I wanted kids to read it. So it ended up sort of positioning me in a different way. And I've done, over the past 20 years, I've done so many events at embassies and anime cons and universities, Smith College, Harvard, all these places, rooted in the book.
Always comes back to the book.
It does. It's amazing. And the book, Haruki Murakami's in the book, Miyazaki's. It's not just anime and manga people. So, people sometimes have me in to talk about not just anime and manga, but Japanese culture, contemporary culture. Then you can talk about Murakami Haruki. Then you can talk about Murakami Takashi. You can talk about a broader set of issues. So it did change a lot for me. It also made me much more oriented toward visual culture. I was much more, focused on literature, prose, poetry, films, some films, French New Wave, that kind of thing. But the book made me much more aware of visual culture. And, I was just at a film festival as a judge in Seoul. I mean, that's partly because I've been watching a lot more visual art.
A lot of the things that you've done since have been anchored back to this book. And this book starts a little bit also with Osamu Tezuka.
Yes,
about whom you're currently trying to put together a documentary. Another big challenging project, I imagine. But tell me a little bit about what is this documentary about? What are you trying to put out there with this work?
Well, Tezuka, as you know, in Japan is the manga no kami-sama. He's the god of manga. Some say the father of anime. Such a pioneering figure in those media. And I was in Shanghai in December, and I talked about Tezuka at a conference there, and everybody knew him. I mean, they had Tezuka tote bags,
okay.
Astro Boy and Blackjack. And in Seoul, where I was last week, everybody knows Tezuka. So when I talked about this project at some private dinners, people were like, "Oh yeah, give me your card. This sounds great." But in the West, so-called West, but in the United States and Europe, Tezuka is surprisingly not that well known, especially after a certain age, a younger age group. Some people of a certain age know Tetsuwan Atom, Astro Boy, or Blackjack, some of those big titles, Jungle Story, Kimba the White Lion. But beyond that, and they don't know much about the guy. So 4 or 5 years ago, the director, Jason Cohn, came to me in California. I was living in California then. And he came and he said, "Listen, I need you on board. I want to do the really serious high-end." And he's an award-winning documentarian. He's done films on Ursula Le Guin and Elliot Noyes, the Eameses. He's a serious high-end documentary filmmaker. And he wanted to do a serious, great, definitive documentary about Tezuka Osamu. And he said he wanted to release it in 2028, which is the year of centennial of Tezuka's birth. So it's perfectly timed. And as it turns out, as I started circulating in New York and LA, a lot of museums around the US and Europe want to do Tezuka retrospectives in 2028. So a lot of people, art museum curators, critics, etc., they're aware. They know Tezuka is this pioneer who is not that well known outside of Asia. So it just seemed like there's a gap and an opportunity to fill that gap and to do it right. And when I had meetings with Jason, and he filmed some early interview material with me and Fred Schott and some other people we know, I could tell he was committed and his team is committed. And, we just did a round of interviews last year with Otomo from Akira, Tomino-san, Gundam, Ikeda-san, Rose of Versailles, Maruyama, the great producer. I mean, all these people, Rintaro, they all said yes.
Everyone's on board.
As soon as I pinged them, they were like, yeah, let's do it. And I think part of it, I don't want to give myself credit because also it's Jason's credentials and so on. But I think also when I am involved, people know that I'll deliver. Like people in the industry here know if I contact them, if I contact them for an interview, the story will appear. I'm not just wasting their time. And I don't contact these people just to shoot the breeze. I contact them when something's happening. And the other thing, of course, is Tezuka. That all of these artists know that he is critical to their careers. I mean, sadly, I had gotten a sort of tentative agreement from the Dragon Ball Toriyama-san. Because Toriyama-san has gone on record saying, I would not have become a mangaka. The guy who created Dragon Ball, I would not have become a mangaka without Tezuka. He was so heavily inspired by Tezuka's work. And he was ready to go, and he died.
Tezuka, born here in Toyonaka in Osaka, I think.
Just up the street, yeah.
You mentioned he watched Bambi 91 times?
81.
81 times.
That's what I was told.
Most people may be familiar with Astro Boy, as you said, but
yeah.
What makes his work so important in the field of manga and animation that everyone in the industry kind of falls back onto him?
The one caveat, he was not the greatest draftsman. He's not the finest visual artist. And in fact, some of his work next to someone like Otomo or, some really skilled artist or Taiyo Matsumoto, it looks pretty primitive. But he was protean. His imagination was protean. He would just turn everything into a story. And consequently, you can credit him for pioneering, if not originating, certain genres in manga and anime. Some people say the shoujo genre would not really exist without his Princess Knight, Riba no Kishi, which incidentally is going to be a Netflix. Netflix has adapted into an anime coming out next month.
Oh.
Coming out in August. He, and part of Riba no Kishi is because of his childhood in Toyonaka, sitting on the laps of these actors from Takaratsuka Gekijo.
Yeah.
He was fascinated by this gender play in the theater of Takaratsuka, these women playing all the roles, including the handsome men and beautiful men, actually. So he creates Riba no Kishi. You could argue that he was crucial to the mecha genre. I mean, starting with Astro Boy, but exploring science and technology in his early manga as a potential, not only solution, but a potential improvement on humanity. Somebody said to me the other day, Tezuka would have embraced AI. He would have said, this is fantastic. Because he actually, in a lot of his writings, believed that if we could get the right technology, maybe we could stop human beings from being such violent, venal jerks. That the technology could improve the humans, not the other way around. And this goes along with an essay I'm writing now, which is that the fear of AI becoming us is backwards. We've become more artificial. We're the ones who are becoming artificial. It's not the intelligence becoming human. We all wake up and look at our phones. We don't look at the sun through the window. We're artificial beings, and we're embracing it. So AI is not the real threat. It's more like Tezuka said, it's humans becoming completely insensitive.
So a lot of very original thoughts and perspectives that have shaped many others' ideas of stories that kind of have spawned from this. And this documentary will be a retrospective on his life and his work.
Yes, and I should mention that it's not just the work. It is very much the life. I mean, he was a teenager when the bombs were falling, the fire bombs in this region. Supposedly almost got killed in a watchtower. He was supposed to be watching for bombers, and he was doodling. And the bombs fell, and actually the people in the shelter were all incinerated. But he survived because he was up in the watchtower when he was supposed to be in the shelter warning people. So there's survivor's guilt in his work. And he saw the rivers full of bodies after the firebombing, people trying to cool their skin. He saw some awful, awful things, and he never forgot them. And his work, some of it is quite violent and graphic and terrifying. He had a phase in his life, he sort of became the manga no kami-sama very young in his career. And then there were a bunch of younger artists, kind of the young punks, gekiga artists who came up and tried to push him out, that he was an old fogey, only made kid stuff. And they made adult-oriented, edgy comics featuring erotic material and drug addiction and so on. And Tezuka jumped in the ring with him. And he made equally dark manga. He didn't back off. In fact, against the advice of his editors, who just wanted him to keep doing Astro Boy and kid stuff. He didn't do that. He went through some troughs in his career. He was a terrible businessman, had bankruptcies. So it's also his life story and and we don't want to push this too far, but sort of paralleling the story of post-war Japan. Mm-hmm. Its rise, and it's also its compromises, and I think its identity crisis. I mean, I do think fundamental to so many stories in manga and anime, from Tezuka all the way up to Kimetsu no Yaiba, is a deep sense of doubt about the self and about identity. And I don't think it's too pushing it. I mean, I do this in Japanamerica, but I don't think it's pushing it too far to say that post-war Japan in particular, being occupied by the United States for 7 years, and then arguably still occupied with 50,000 troops.
50,000, wow.
Yeah, over 50,000. In fact, a lot of people don't realize this, but there are more US troops based in Japan than in any other country outside of the US, including Germany, including South Korea, including the UK. There are more US troops here than anywhere else. There are troops up and down, there are a lot of American troops here.
I didn't realize that many, but I can see to your point then that this brings up a lot of interesting questions that some artists will then try to process through their work, through their illustrations and such. For you now, the task is to get this documentary done. We talked about the challenges of making Japanamerica, the interviews. You need to seek out all the partners. I imagine doing it for a documentary is a different kind of challenge, not easier, maybe more complicated, maybe not. But the plan is for 2028 for the anniversary. What are some of these challenges that you're facing in kind of bringing this project there, or so that people will be able to go over this retrospective and see this?
Well, one of the ideas that and fortunately Jason had, the director, Jason Cohn, from the very beginning, is that we want to animate some of the documentary. Mm-hmm. So not just, Tezuka Productions is fully on board with us, which is great. They said, we love it. You can have access to the archives and the vaults. But we don't want it to just be nothing against PBS or NHK, but we don't want it to just be like, and here's an old clip of Tezuka's 1971, that kind of dry. Mm-hmm. We want it to be narrative. We want it to be punchy. Like Tezuka's real work itself, not like a classroom project. So in order to do that, one of the ideas we have from the very beginning is to actually animate some of the film. So one example is you might be seeing Katsuhiro Otomo talking on screen, and then the face dissolves into an animated rendition of Otomo. And you might see, Tetsuo behind him peering down, right? And one reason to do that is not just to be clever, but to illustrate to those viewers who might watch the film but might not be animation fans what animation can do that live action cannot do. Why do you animate something? Mm-hmm. What's the point? It's not a lesser form. It's a different form. And, we're talking to Del Toro, and Del Toro has said, Del Toro has said up front, he thinks animation is a more efficient and beautiful way of telling a story. He loves animation. One thing he said was, it's more efficient in terms of action. Like he said, when you have a live action, when you have a real human being, an actor, reaching down to pick up a glass of coffee or a glass of water, there's so much data that is recorded and that the viewer has to take in. You know, the facial expression, the eye droop, the movement, there's all these movements in the hand itself, the knuckles. But he said, when you animate something, you can do it very quickly and very leanly and just have the viewer focused on what you want them to see.
Interesting, yeah.
Because there's much less data. You control more of the data when it's an animated production.
Mm-hmm.
So these kinds of concepts, without sitting there and explaining them, talking head style, we want to be able to embody them in the film. Why would this guy devote his life to comic books and cartoons, as the Americans would say? Why would you do that? And why would you think you could tell the story of Cleopatra in animation? What's the point? There is a point to doing that. This is the reason why Grave of the Fireflies, some of those great films, they've tried to make live action. It never works.
It never works, no.
Because there's something animation does that live action can't do. There's nothing wrong with that. But I think there might be viewers of the film who think, oh, who's this post-war artist from Japan that this film is about? They might not be particularly drawn to animation. But if they can see in the film itself why a serious artist and a committed artist might devote themselves to this medium, then I think the film is more successful.
So we'll put the link in the description for people that are curious to keep up with the production, maybe support the production as well, as there's a lot of work to be done and to get all these animations, get all of these people together. Quite a big challenge. You're working on this, but it's not the only thing you're working on. You're doing a lot of other things, some of which we have on the table. You briefly mentioned this magazine, Monkey, for which you're an editor as well. Contributing editor. You have this beautiful hardcover book here about Blade Runner. Where has your writing career then taken you? What are the projects that you've kind of gone into by yourself, not because it was commissioned to you, but out of your own interests, and so to say, maybe like the documentary, but there's many more on many different aspects of Japan.
Yeah, well, I've been working on a novel off and on for a number of years, and I feel like I started my writing fiction and publishing fiction. Short stories were the first writings that I published. Actually, the first thing I published was a poem when I was 16 in a national magazine.
Oh.
So I've been writing for a long time. And I feel now, before it gets too late, I want to circle back to fiction writing. But what I'm hoping, and I think this is true, that my in-between career, more focused on journalism and nonfiction, has helped to deepen my sensibility as a fiction writer. And in particular, I've been delving into my Japanese family more deeply in recent years. My grandfather was a poet and a scholar, and my mother's family, the Saekis, were samurai, basically, Bushido. So they lived in this incredible house, which is now almost 400 years old, and is up in Isashi, Mizusawa Isashi, which is just south of Morioka. The house is extraordinarily well preserved. A great uncle was living there, and he took care of it. Now his son is there living in an adjacent building, because they built an adjacent house so they wouldn't be living in the house itself. The house itself feels like a museum. It's incredible. There are 3 kura warehouses on the property.
Wow.
One of which holds what's left of the family's armory, swords. I mean, incredible, these katana.
I'm just trying to picture everything.
It's pretty amazing. One of which, another one, which is beautifully kept, is my grandfather's library, which is massive. Over 1,000 books.
Oh.
Some of them, he was complicated. He worked with the Internal Affairs Division of the Japanese government during the war. So he was basically in charge of keeping an eye on writers. On the one hand, potentially reporting them if they wrote the wrong thing. On the other hand, trying to protect them so they wouldn't get reported.
Just letting them know beforehand, maybe don't use this word or don't write about this topic so much.
Yeah. I mean, he was one of many Japanese who, after the war was over, A, didn't have a job anymore, and B, didn't want to talk about it at all. But there are framed photos of him sitting right next to Kawabata Yasunari. The great Miyazaki Kenji stopped by the house, and my grandfather has a first edition Miyazawa Kenji book
about the
library.
rainbow.
Yeah.
Oh.
So it's quite a rich library, but of course, personally, I'm interested in his own work and stories about his life. You know, in some ways, I knew him as this avuncular, charming, he was always smiling. For a Japanese guy of that generation, he smiled a lot. And you're holding me on his knee, and we would sort of mock sumo wrestle in his tatami mat rooms in the old house. That's how I knew him. And, you know, the other thing he used to do is he would buy me anything I wanted. So we'd be walking, you know, when I was a teenager, walking through Tokyo, my mom, my grandfather, and my grandmother. And I would see a synthesizer in the window, Yamaha DX7. Oh, wow, that's so nice. It's beautiful. It's perfect. You know, my mother would say, we're not bringing that home, and we're not. No, but Mom, we can ship it. No, we're not doing that. You know. And so we'd walk down the street. And my grandfather would circle back. Yeah, and he would order it. He wouldn't. He was smart enough not to carry it around.
Because your mom would stop.
My mom would stop him. Say, where are you, Oji-chan? You know. And then he'd come back, and then sure enough, the next day,
it will arrive.
The delivery guy would be there with the Yamaha DX7. And my grandfather he was so sweet. He would always calm my mother down and say, we will send it to America. Don't worry. You don't have to take it on the plane. You don't have to worry about it. So that was my grandfather to me. But then, you know, learning about his past and his kind of torture experiences during the war, working for this internal affairs division between artists and the government, and losing his job completely and deciding after some trials and tribulations to spend the rest of his life in Morioka, even though his wife wanted to come back to Tokyo. She wanted to be in the middle of things. But he just said, I'm 40 years old. I don't have a job. I can't afford to go back to Tokyo.
Tokyo was already expensive back then.
It was expensive. And not only that, it was crawling with young men. You know, after the war, this sort of the baby boom happened as it did elsewhere. So when I was sort of studying my grandfather's personal history, I was realizing, oh, right, he went back to Tokyo at his wife's urging. And he apparently reported not only was he having trouble finding a job, you know, all these young Turks were like, oh, come on, old man. He's 40 years old, right? And he actually was part of the government during the war.
Yeah.
And on top of that, he said, the trains are packed. It's really, you know, I'm 40. I can't do it anymore. I can't hustle. So that to me struck me as really kind of poignant on a personal level. So what I've done is done all this research, and I'm writing nonfiction, an essay, which I hope will be for the New Yorker, on my grandfather and the house. But at the same time, I'm working these stories into the novel, because there's a way. I still think fiction is the greatest way to explore the interior life. Nonfiction can do so amazing things. Nonfiction essays, so creative
can change your life.
Can change your life, yes. It can sell books, but I think in terms of the interior experience of being human, and that's something, you know, I really want to circle back to these years now.
So it's kind of coming full circle for you in a way, the upbringing here in the summers in Japan with your grandfather, without realizing that he's done this amount of work in writing, in literature and such. And then you kind of, in a way, picking up the mantle and writing and editing and putting out a lot of literary work in magazines, in books, and more. Do you feel like now, looking back at and researching all of this, you see how that may have influenced also your work and your perspectives? Or do you look at your own work now from a different lens after learning all of these things about your family history and your grandfather?
That's a great question, Tobias, because I must have known at some point as a teenager that Granddad, Oji-chan, was a writer. But I didn't, well, maybe I didn't want to, but I feel like I didn't make the connection with my own passion for writing, my own obsession with writing. Because, I'll fully admit, I've been obsessed with writing since I was about 13, 14 years old. And after I realized I was not going to be a pro hockey player or a rock star, it became the one thing I wanted to do. And as some people have said to me, you're kind of fortunate if you know at a fairly young age, this is what I want to do. Mm-hmm. It doesn't always mean you have the talent for it, but it's what you want to do. And I definitely knew writing. And so I've come, especially as I've gotten older, to really realize that, you must have known your grandfather was a poet. And then I know he knew that I was in New York writing, because my mother said at one point, I was very happy to hear this, that he was very proud of me, that I was doing something he felt was noble, a real calling. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, but it's funny. It's taken me a long time to sort of really draw the connections and really look at his life and think about how he must have felt at certain times in his life as a Japanese person after the war, having worked with the government and seen not only the United States take its big brotherly role with post-war Japan, mm-hmm. but also his eldest daughter, who was a valedictorian at Jochi, moved to America, and then to have a grandson like me, who's half, coming over from the former enemy and sitting, sleeping on the, futon in his house. What was going on there?
Yeah, it must have been interesting times as well, I guess, for them to see these changes happening in the same way as your father probably experienced the change of Japanese culture coming to the United States and kind of taking over Macy's Parade and more. Your body of work is quite wide. We haven't talked about a lot of the things that you've done and put out there, but is there anything in particular that I didn't ask you about that we didn't touch upon that you would still like to bring up in today's conversation?
I think we were going to talk a little bit about the teaching I've done mm-hmm. over the years, and I've done it only full time a couple of times. Most of them have been part-time guest professor, visiting professor gigs. But I just wanted to add that I've come to really appreciate the teaching. I mean, it almost never pays, but appreciate teaching at the university level subjects I want to teach, mm-hmm. Literature, pop culture, post-war culture, because it forces me to interface with people half my age. And I have a niece who's 6 years old, but I don't have kids of my own. So I've realized how invaluable it is to mm-hmm. be able to sit and get paid to talk to 21-year-olds, 22-year-olds about everything, about AI, about streaming. What do you think of this? About digital media, social media. I have an excuse to talk to smart young students. And now I'm at Waseda, but I was at Todai for a while. I've taught at NYU. And of course, there are cultural differences, big mm-hmm. cultural differences as well. But the opportunity, and I'm actually quite grateful that I think I did inherit from my father, my American father, because he was a marine biologist and professor. But the capacity to stand up in front of a group and deliver an engaging conversation, where people are hopefully enwrapped and listening and to have dialogues with those people.
And as you explained before, maybe also the challenging upbringing of changing schools many times to be able to talk to the different audiences and adapt to the students from different universities. One thing I'm curious about is you just explained how you enjoy the teaching part and interacting with those students. But before you even came to Japan in 98 for the JET program, you were teaching back in the States. Now you still do some teaching. You're teaching in Waseda on, I guess, always similar topics or like similar range of topics. Have you noticed big changes in the questions the students ask over those decades, where their interest really lies, and how they approach the same topic maybe in 2000 or 2010 and now in 2020s?
Yeah, I would say if they're American students or non-Japanese students, they know much more about Japan than they used to. It doesn't mean they know much about Japanese society, but they know much more about Japanese pop culture and sometimes Japanese literature too. There's much more awareness. The Japanese students, by contrast, I shouldn't say by contrast, but by comparison, I would say that they're much more confident talking about Japan, because I'm often teaching about the way Japan is perceived overseas. And they used to be quite shy about that. And they're much more articulate and confident talking about that. And I will also say there are many more people like me now. When I was growing up, in the towns that my parents moved to, I hardly knew anyone who was Asian. In fact, I didn't in most of those towns. So there's no other Asians, and certainly nobody else who was Japanese. So it was like my mom, and then my grandparents, if they came, and then my uncle and cousins. That was it. Nobody else in those towns was Japanese. There were no Japanese restaurants. I did watch, what was it? Battleship Yamato on TV. It was called Star Blazers in America, with a friend of mine, but he didn't know it was Japanese. I did, and I didn't tell him.
That's an interesting thing that a few guests have brought up as well. They grew up maybe also playing Pokemon or other, without knowing this was from Japan, and only later realized and made the connection like, oh, all these things that I was doing as a kid are from Japan.
I mean, it's interesting because I know that my friend at the time, we used to run home to watch the episodes of Star Blazers. We knew it wasn't American. I mean, we knew it wasn't typical, because it was somewhat sexy and it was a little edgy, and sometimes it didn't make any sense to us. And, partly because they chopped it up for American television. So the scripts didn't always make sense. But it was absolutely entrancing. There's something riveting about it. So I shouldn't say he didn't know it was Japanese. We never talked about it. But again, that was at a time before Japan was on the radar, really. It was electronics, automobiles, and then if you saw the documentaries that they showed on American TV at that time, it was pretty grim.
Yeah, I can imagine.
But, that's something I should say. Obviously, it's not nearly as grim as those documentaries made Japan look. But I often feel like those of us who live in Japan, we're not born and raised here, we sort of become a bit blinkered in our lives here, which could happen anywhere. But because of Japan's sort of relatively codified society, and you sort of learn to behave a certain way, which is why tourists are so irritating here. And they're not irritating to me in New York. In New York, it's everybody's from everywhere. And you can throw your stuff in the street. Nobody cares. But here, it's really an affront when tourists, are dragging huge suitcases on the train and talking on their phone. But I do feel like we sometimes forget. I mean, certainly as an American, and I go back to the States a lot, people who are middle class have huge refrigerators, islands in their kitchen, incredibly vast leather sofas.
Big.
Sorry?
Everything's big.
Everything is big, but also it's quite luxurious. I mean, it is still true, even in 2026. When you choose to live in Japan, you are cutting things down, not just in terms of size, but you sort of have to economize. Unless you're, expat CEO sent over here on a corporate account and you live with your family in some penthouse, Azabu, whatever. There are those lifestyles where it's almost like you're transferring a Miami penthouse to Tokyo. Okay. But unless you are living like that, most of us have accepted the pinched living codes of Japan. put out the garbage at this time, put out this metal at this time, but let's face it. I mean, a Japanese kitchen, even in a nice apartment, usually has a rangey, and maybe a toaster oven or something like that. And then I go to the States, and even people, like I said, I'm not diminishing them, but people who are not making six figures have huge stainless steel fridge and an oven that's big enough that you can roast a turkey and roast a leg of lamb, and beautiful tabletops and marble sometimes on the floor. And you think, wow, you sort of tend to forget that in Japan there is a still, even in 2026, a kind of willingness to live with less. And I don't mean that in a pejorative way, but I was telling somebody in New York last month that I can picture Japanese people. I can look at Japanese people in a railway car and say, you could take all of these people and stick them in Miami right now, and they'd be fine. Maybe the language be a problem, but they would be, oh, we're on Miami Beach. Let's have some snow cones. But if I look at the same group of people in the United States, I could not just stick them on that train car in Tokyo. They would be too big in some cases. They would be completely claustrophobic. What are we doing in this car? What's going on, right? And the capacity to, we've all done this.
Yeah,
squeeze in, hold your phone here, and just wait for the next stop. Maybe 5 people will get off, and you can
breathe again, especially now in the summer.
Lower your shoulders. Yeah, I mean, that kind of thing we're accustomed to. But it's not so easy. You couldn't just transplant, certainly not Americans, from a street in any American town, even New York. Even New York, there are people who would just be like that. I can't.
So for you as a writer, as an author, looking for material for your fiction or for your nonfiction, seeing the development of both of those countries that you grew up in provides endless amount of inspiration, I imagine. And for us, that means we will be able to see a lot of your work coming up, your articles, your essays, hopefully out soon as well. And the documentary, which all the links will be in the description so people can keep up.
Yeah, I'm excited about that. I think it's kind of, at least in terms of the Japanamerica side of my life, which is not everything. I mean, I write about economics and politics, literature. Yeah, did a 60 minutes interview about the birth rate in Japan. So, but the Japanamerica side of my life, the Tezuka documentary feels kind of full circle. Like, go back to the beginning. That was certainly one of the first big interviews I did at Tezuka Productions. And it taught me so much. I mean, they spent the whole day and then the next morning with me, just talking about Tezuka and what he did, and talking about other artists who were inspired by him. So to be able to take the next step and say, look, I want you to know about this artist and all the other artists who in Japan, and not just in Japan, we're talking to cartoonists and comic book artists in Europe and in Mexico and in the United States, and those guys know Tezuka. They know. So it's gratifying.
Roland, thank you very much for sharing some of your stories, some of your work and your insights. For more people can go and read, I think, what you've already put out there. And maybe there will be an opportunity to have you back again to talk about the documentary once it's out, to go over everything and maybe the challenges of productions and more, and some different perspectives that came from doing this. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you everyone for listening and watching. This was Unpacking Japan, and we'll see you in the next episode. Take care. Wow.
All right.
Wow.
Was that long?
That was 1 hour and 40. Thanks for sticking with us until the end. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing to Unpacking Japan. It's the best way to help us grow and ensures we can keep bringing you these deep dives every week. Till next time, take care.